Good evening, everyone. I am so happy to see so many folks this evening for this great segment presented by the Alamo Trust. Thank you for attending. This evening, we will focus on the Alamo and how it addresses slavery in Mexico, Texas, and the US from a period of 1820 to 1846. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Barbara Gervin-Hawkins. I'm state representative of District 120, located in the San Antonio area. This evening, I hope you not only have a great takeaway and hear great historical information, but it becomes an experience tonight as we celebrate Black History Month and we learn more and more about the African American culture. To me, you're headed for a great treat. Now, I'm honored tonight to introduce our moderator as well as our speaker. Our moderator, which is Robyn Oguinye, who will moderate our questions at the end. So Robyn is a reporter from News 4 out of San Antonio. She is from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And as I told her earlier this evening, we won't hold that against her. But she has spent the last 4.5 years reporting and anchoring in Iowa and most recently in Wisconsin. So she has been around. Now she's glad to be back in the South where she's closer to family and friends, and we're happy to have her back. As a longtime ballerina and a soccer player, which to me is odd because ballerina is soft-toed and we know what soccer is, you know, it's more hard-toed kicking. But she's been able to balance that. Now, one of the things Robyn has requested since she's been here in the South, she said, send her to the best gym we can find so that she can run off some of this food this good food that she's been eating in the South. So Robyn, we're happy to have you here tonight. Then I'd like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker, Dr. Carey Latimore. He's a professor, an associate professor at Trinity University. He's also an author of the Alamo's Report on Civil Rights in San Antonio, World War II to the 1960s. Tonight, he's going to discuss slavery and how it's changed Mexico, Texas, and the US. Now, Dr. Latimore, he also holds a MA, a master's degree, and a Ph.D. in United States history from Emory University, and a bachelor's from the University of Richmond. He's a specialist on African American and Southern history. Dr. Latimore is particularly interested in the construction of African American communities from the Reconstruction period through the Civil Rights era. His academic and public scholarship has been published in a number of venues, such as the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, Our Daily Bread Ministries, Urban Ministries, Austin American Statesman, and the San Antonio Express News, among many other newspaper outlets. He's a frequent commentator for various outlets, as well as he deals with issues about land ownership. You know, I wanted to also share that Dr. Latimore is a Baptist minister. So if he gets to, you know, doing what we do in our church, and he's a member of my church, just put it in the chat. And if you would just want to say that, hallelujah, amen, we're open for that also.
Amen.
Now, to make sure that we're all can hear and we know what's going on, there's a few housekeeping rules that I think we want to hear too. Make sure that your device is muted so that we can hear everybody talk. It would be nice if your camera is off because it helps us improve the quality of the Zoom that we get. Now, if you have any questions throughout this process, go to your chat, write your question in the chat, and then we'll answer them in the end. I also want you to know that this event will be recorded. And so tonight, we hope you enjoy the discussion. We do want it to be interactive, and we want you to have the greatest takeaway that you can. With that, I proudly introduce Dr. Carrie Latimore.
Thank you, Representative Hawkins. And I first wanted to thank the Alamo Trust for the invitation to come here, the GLO. It's really an honor to be here to speak to you at this time. I want to recognize Robyn for being here and to moderate this event and welcome her to San Antonio. I know it's kind of weird to move to San Antonio during a pandemic. And so it's odd getting to know people with masks and other kinds of things. And so welcome to San Antonio. And to each and every one of you, it is an honor. I am a descendant of slaves. And I was blessed that my parents, particularly my mother and grandmother, made sure that I knew who my ancestors were. We made family trips on Saturday. I was always taken to Colonial Parkway in Williamsburg, Virginia. And they would take me by where the old plantation house was that my great-great-grandfather was enslaved. The house was no longer there, but my mother would point it out because she remembered seeing the house because her mother told her that was the house and showed her the house and talked about what happened to my great-great-grandfather there. And those stories were transferred to me. And so I felt very close to my great-great-grandfather. And I knew other ancestors who were slaves and where they lived. And so the names and places and lives and all of those things were given to me. And I see that as a treat and a blessing. I knew where my ancestors came from, and I also knew who my ancestors were. I also recognized and was later informed as I got old enough to recognize that some of my ancestors, like my great-great-great-grandfather, was a slave owner, my great-great-grandfather. And so they had the same bloodline. And so my bloodline traces all of those ancestries, those black and white, it's all of those things. It's two sides of one coin. And so when I come to this speech and this talk, I recognize all of my ancestry as a struggle within me, but also as a struggle within Americans to come to some type of reconciliation of who and what we are. And so as we think about slavery, we should recognize just how peculiar the institution is. Now, some people will tell you that it's very simple. Black people were enslaved, and that is true, but it's deeper than that. Some people would say that we have to understand that a slave is a slave and has no power. Theoretically, they don't have power, but there are ways in which slaves have certain types of privileges that they might have. There are people who may say that, why is the Alamo even talking about slavery? I've read the comment sections out there. And it's interesting to me that people might say, why are we talking about slavery and digging up old history at the Alamo, which is a place that we talk about our history. We share our history. We celebrate our history. Well, slavery is also part of that history. Now, one side may say that we've talked enough about slavery. It's been properly dealt with, they say. I say that's not true. There may be another side that says that that agrees that we should talk more about slavery, but that we should erase certain aspects of that institution as well. And I would say that they're wrong too. We should recognize the complexities, and we should want to investigate and explore all of those complexities. Indeed, I would argue that in dealing with this issue and the subject, perhaps it's time to find what I like to call a third way of talking about slavery, a third way of talking about freedom, a third way of talking about justice as part of kind of a similar coin that works within and through and in each other. So let's begin by talking about, as a Virginian named Thomas Jefferson. I'm a Virginian, so I got to start with my folk. Thomas Jefferson was born in 1743. I'm a historian, so we got to go way back beyond the time period in which we're talking about. But at the time that Jefferson was born, most of the slaves in America, and that's the eastern coast of America, because slavery is basically primarily on that eastern Atlantic coast, from all the way up from the northeast on down to really South Carolina and Georgia. Most slaves were born in Africa. Most slaves had not been introduced to the Christian faith yet. We hadn't had the first and second Great Awakening. Very few slaves were engaged in raising cotton. They were mostly in other kinds of farm type things or tobacco, which we'll talk about later, is very hard on the soil. The slave population in America, or what we now know as America, was not able to reproduce itself naturally. And so you had to continuously ship slaves in, whether it be from Africa or the West Indies. And so slaves are continuously coming in from another place. 80 years later, at Thomas Jefferson's death, slavery had changed. A series of monumentous revolutions had transformed the institution, and one could argue that America was transformed as well by that time. A majority of slaves was now born in the New World. And so once you had a population that was primarily African or West Indian, and now you have a population that's primarily Creole, born here. And so as you think about these revolutions, other revolutions are happening as well. There's a plantation revolution. Masters are now seeking ways to make their plantations efficient units. You see, a plantation owner is a business owner. And we must also recognize that slavery is a business. And so they're setting up their plantations to be as efficient as possible, to run as efficiently. We think about business now, everybody wants business to be efficient. Well, slave masters wanted it to be that way as well. They wanted it to be productive. And so this kind of transition is going to eventually split the South really in two parts. An upper South that's going to move more towards farming. So the upper South masters are going to move towards corn, wheat, oats, and things like that after the Revolutionary War. And the lower South, because it's more conducive to growing cotton, is going to move more towards cotton production. And because of other things, the cotton gin, that area is going to be more heavily populated percentage-wise with slavery. And slavery is going to make a transition from that old Atlantic coast on down towards the Gulf Coast. So slavery is starting to move from the north to the upper South, to the lower South, to the Gulf South. So it's making a transition south and southwest. And so slavery is on the move. But as slavery is on the move, think of what else is happening. The revolutionary period and the ideas of the American Revolution of freedom and justice, and how the initial revolutionaries detested the idea of slavery, even if they owned slaves themselves. It was a question mark of whether human beings could be slaves. And so the ideas of the Enlightenment, the ideas of the Great Awakening, the ideas of this political transformation is really casting for the first time in the world a kind of complexity about the institution of slavery. People are looking at it and questioning, is this the right and moral institution? And so slavery is now running away in a sense from itself as people are questioning whether it's legitimate. And so many of our founders felt that way too. And so after the American Revolution, some books question whether the American Revolution was actually revolutionary or not in regards to slavery. Historians sometimes say that, well, it didn't end slavery. Well, it ended slavery in the North, and it moved slavery south and southwest. The American Revolutionary, the ideas of the revolution had an effect on slavery in France. And so if you think about that, the latter part of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century, slavery is really running away from itself. Many people who were founders of America thought that slavery would eventually die out. And if you asked any of the founders, they probably thought that slavery would eventually die out at some point in time. Now, they would never say when it would die out. It could be 200 years down the road, but they felt that it was on a way to extinction. But one thing is kind of ironic in this conversation is that as slavery seems to be dying out in some areas of the world, it experiences kind of a comeback. So as it leads to emancipation and freedom and manumission in areas of the US and areas of the Caribbean and Spanish America and France, you also see it strengthening in other areas. And so if I can get the screen here and right here, take a look. And so one of the things that happens is that America at this point in time is also expanding. And so it's the era of expansion, the Louisiana Purchase, and eventually we're going to get to the annexation of Texas. But these kinds of things are bringing new territories into the United States. As it's bringing in new territories to the United States, you have that, we talked about plantation revolutions and other kinds of things, but remember that in the Upper South, the area where slaves used to be predominant, soil is getting pretty rough. Generations of growing cotton is leaving the soil eroded. And so you've got bad soil. I lived in Virginia. If you don't rotate your crops, you will have problems growing things. And so masters are looking for other places to go. And so there are opportunities to be had in the South and the Southwest. And Eli Whitney's cotton gin is going to allow for the processing of cotton, and cotton is going to become the major cash crop. But cotton is going to require a lot of slaves. It's going to require a lot of land. And that's something that's held in these new territories. Territories such as Alabama, Mississippi, areas of Louisiana. Now, America is also going to find a way to move Native Americans out as well during this period. And that's perfect cotton growing area as well. Now, ironically, some of the people that have moved out are also enslaved by Native Americans. So slavery is being moved out of this area into other areas, and slavery is moving into the lower South from the upper South. And so there's a trail, in a sense, we talk about a trail of tears, which is true, but there's also a trail of African-American tears coming down from the upper South to the lower South to the Gulf South. Historians estimate that about 1 million slaves would be moved from the upper South to the lower South between the late 1700s and about 1860. In other words, more slaves will be moved domestically than slaves that entered America from Africa. The estimates say that about 400 to 500,000 Africans entered what we now know as the United States. Double that would be transferred during this period. And so it's a tremendous amount of mobility that's happening in this area. One of the slaves who made this trip was a woman named Sarah Graves. She ended up in Missouri. And she said this in the 1930s. She said, I was brought to Missouri when I was 6 months old. So basically her parents told her this. Or should we say her mother? She said my mother, who was a slave owned by a man named Shaw, who had allotted her to a man named Jimmy Graves, who came to Missouri to live with his daughter. We left my papa in Kentucky because he was allotted to another man. My papa never knew where my mother went, and my mother never knew where papa went. They never wanted mama to know because they know that she would never marry so long as she knew where he was. Our master wanted her to marry again and raise more children to be slaves. They never wanted mama to know where papa was, and she never did. This is the consequence of this mobility, because slaves are being broken up, family units are being broken up. And so we can look at it as an economic move, but it's also a personal move of people south and southwest. And so you think about Missouri, this new territory being brought in, but it's also in the areas of Mississippi, Alabama, other areas of Louisiana. And yes, it will involve Texas. So we think about that cotton revolution. And as cotton is really growing in popularity, the price of slaves is increasing 3 times over a 20-year period. So slaves that once carried about $500 in value now will be sold by the 1820s for $1,500. So slaves are valuable assets, which will then have another effect on masters manumitting their slaves. While manumit a slave will allow a slave to purchase their freedom when you can sell them for higher prices. And so the number of free African Americans in the upper South, which had been increasing between 1780 and 1800, starts to decrease by 1810. And so you start to see slavery strengthening up as the cotton production increases. But also it's something else that happens by Congress. In 1808, Congress outlaws the international slave trade. Now, that's a good thing. But what the banning of the international slave trade does is make slaves here more valuable. And so at the same time that you have this renewed interest in the Gulf South, you have Congress outlawing or banning the international slave trade. And so now there's more pressure on slaves in the upper South to keep them or to sell them further south. And so as slavery is kind of gaining, as I was saying earlier, kind of a resuscitation, gaining strength in other areas. And it's not just in America that slavery is gaining strength. In Brazil, in Cuba, in other places, slavery too is growing in strength. And so you're really having almost a two worlds development of slavery in this new world. Some areas have use of it, primarily because of the land, and other areas less so. But when we think about it, it's that irony of the growth of slavery, the questioning of slavery. As Britain and France are increasing in their anti-slavery rhetoric, those same colonies still have slaves in the New World. And so how do they deal with that? How do we come as people to bring all of this complexity together? People deal with it. And so what's happening here? What's happening in Texas? If we think about Texas, and we're Texans now, somewhat of a Texan now, Texans see ourselves as kind of the center of the universe. Well, in 1800, we really weren't. We were just an outpost in the Spanish New World that had very little population, very little interest. Population that was here, the Tejanos that were here and others, they were raided numerous times. It was a question mark, it was a frontier, basically. And so as a frontier, think about how frontier people live, but also think of the problems that it created for the Spanish Empire in controlling this area. And so eventually, Spain is going to say, we need to control this area. How do we do that? And you've got this population that needs land, and you also increasingly have a financial problem because land in the United States is increasing in value. So as slave masters want to move south and west, or maybe not even just slave masters, others want to move south and west to claim their fortune, the land that they want is too expensive for them or very expensive. But you have this new territory. And then perhaps you might have some territory in this area called Texas, that we now call Texas, that might be reasonable, that might be acquired for cheap. And then in 1819, you have the Panic of 1819. Many people go in debt. Moses Austin is one of them. He's got creditors on his butt. And when you have creditors, people look for a way to escape. And Texas was one of those ways to escape. So he sets up deals with the Spanish government. Spanish government's like, yeah, we can do this because it can bring stability to this region that was unstable in their mind. And if you do that, you can bring finance and money. So he sets up a pretty good deal for himself. And if he can pull this off, he might be able to make a good amount of money from it and to start again. And so when you think about the people who are moving here, they're looking to start again. In a sense, it's almost an American story. People who came to Virginia, many of them were the same kind of way, second and third children of prominent men, looking to start again because there wasn't much left for them in the old world. And they come here seeking a new life, a new existence into a frontier. And they have to deal with that frontier life existence. But let me also say, and I'll step back a little bit, as this area is moving out, and as we talked about the Native Americans being moved out of the Trail of Tears, they're also moving out of good cotton growing area too. So as they move out into Oklahoma, others are coming in, claiming that land and growing cotton there. And so slaves, even if they'd already been there, are still coming there and being acquired. So it's a very business-centric thing that's happening in this region during this period. So Texas has the land. Spain has the incentive to work with them, although now recognize that Spain is in its own war with Mexico because the Mexican residents want their own independence. And so with Hidalgo, for the last 10 years, they've been dealing with their own wars. And so in a sense, both groups see kind of the Anglo-Texans perhaps as an ally in all of this once things get established, because if you don't stabilize this area, it's going to be a problem. And so once the Mexicans take over, establish their own nation here, they continue the grants with Austin and eventually others. And so you start to have a wave of Anglo-Texans coming in, working with the Tejanos and setting up business. Now, the land in Texas, very similar to what they would see in Alabama and Mississippi, and they can grow cotton here and they can do it very well. The land here is much different than what you'll see in New Mexico and California. And so that's why Texas is going to emerge differently than New Mexico and California. Initially, until that gold rush, people were kind of moving through California. You didn't have a large population, but in Texas, it gets a larger population quicker because people are starting to want to establish cotton plantations here. And so cotton and slavery are kind of setting and laying the foundation for what's going to happen in Texas. So in a sense, Texas, particularly the eastern part, is going to be kind of the connection to the Mississippi. It's going to link Alabama and Mississippi to Texas, and it's going to bring Texas really into that Gulf South. And because it's part of that Gulf South, it's going to develop very similarly to the Gulf South because of its land, its culture, et cetera. The people are setting it up in that way. Now, one of the things that we also have to recognize is that as more people came from 1821 to 1836, we also have to recognize that in Mexico was going through a number of changes as well. The Mexican Revolution didn't handle all of the problems within Mexico. And you still had questions over what kind of government would be established in Mexico. Are you going to have a centralized state or a centralized government or a more federalist government, or where the states are basically controlling themselves? And if you do, what does that do with slavery? And if you have a centralized government, who does that grant more power to? And so you have struggles within Mexico over who gains power. But one thing about the Mexican Revolution is that even though it talked about uniting people, and the Mexican Revolution has a lot of ideals and principles very similar to the American Revolution, also similar to the American Revolution, it doesn't break down class distinctions. It does lead to an antagonism towards slavery, but other types of unfree labor, it doesn't really take care of. Additionally, it doesn't handle the fact that the Creole population and the Spaniard population, those with Spanish blood from Spain, control the majority of political positions and land. And so it doesn't equalize that. But it does create a nation that is antagonistic towards slavery. It's antagonistic towards slavery because of its past, but also the majority of Mexican territory doesn't really utilize slavery or need slavery that much. But they do have terms of debt servitude, and others that can keep people unfree. But as far as slavery itself, chattel slavery by generation, the Mexican leaders are antagonistic towards it. Maybe the idealistic principles of their own revolution leads them towards that, but it's going to lead them to an opposition with the Americans coming into Texas. So you're going to have a period of 15 years of where Texans are going to be in conflict with the Mexican government or the Mexican state over how to handle the issue of slavery. So if you think about a person like Moses Austin or his son Samuel Austin, he doesn't think that you can have a state that can develop very fast without slavery. And so this is what's happening here. The Americans that are coming into Texas are trying to figure out how can you build a state, and to build it fast. And if you're forced with that kind of question to establish it and to establish a stable population, and they're coming from the southern states, they see slavery as the way to do that. It's a way that you can have a labor force. It's the way that you can acquire a lot of property and have the ability to make profit. And it's also the system that they understood. And so they're just moving it into Texas. In 1823, Mexico will forbid the sale or purchase of slaves and require that children be freed. Texans are like, whatever. 1825, there are 1,300 Anglo-Americans, 443 people who were Black, mostly slaves. 1827, the federalist state of Coahuila and Tejas outlawed the introduction of additional slaves and granted freedom at birth to children born, but that's not really listened to. In Mexico, the country of Mexico will abolish slavery, but then it will grant an exception to that until 1830, 1 year. The Americans in Texas basically say, well, we can turn them into servants and we can make them sign contracts for a certain amount of money that they'll never be able to pay. And so they're not theoretically slaves, but they are. So you have these worker contracts. So you have a negotiation over the title that they would have, but not over what they really were and what was the intention. But what that negotiation does do is it leads to people who intend to come into Texas. It makes them question whether they want to come here or not. Because even though land is cheaper, the opportunities are fresh, you don't want to deal with a state that may outlaw slavery if this is your only chance. If you've been dealing with the panic in 1819 and you think about losing everything and you get a little bit and you move and then the state or the country says, no, you can't have this. And so a lot of Americans who might have wanted to come into Texas didn't. Or they moved somewhere else that slavery could be more secure. And you might understand that because it's a big risk. There's a guy named J.E. Phelps of Missouri who was thinking of moving to Texas, and he wrote to Samuel Austin and said, nothing appears at present to prevent a portion of our wealthy planters from immigrating immediately to the province of Texas, but the uncertainty now prevailing with regard to the subject of slavery. So one of the things that was preventing Texas from becoming even bigger during a period where it was part of Mexico was slavery. It was preventing some from coming here because they were afraid of bringing their resources in, their property in, and then having the state or the national government say, you can't have that and you won't be compensated for them if slavery is ended. And that was their fear. So this raises another question. As we move from the back and forth between Mexico and the government in Texas, or the people in Texas, or the Anglos in Texas, and the Tejanos there, as Mexico goes through its own transformation of, does it want to have a federalist state or a centralized state? As it moves towards a dictatorship with Santa Anna, what role does slavery have in the Texas Revolution? Now, a lot of historians have historically said it had no role at all. More recently, historians and others have said it is the role. I think slavery is a part of the conversation. Federalism and centralized state and Santa Anna's dictatorship is another part of that equation. Slavery cannot be dismissed, but I don't think that it's the central reason for the Texas Revolution. It's part of a larger number of issues. We often find that people don't enter revolutions for one reason. It's a lot of things that lead people to revolution. And you have Mexicans who are not happy with the people moving in, too many of them moving in. You have the Anglos who are unhappy with being told what to do in a dictatorship and being felt that they're being told what to do, told that they need to convert to Catholicism and other kinds of things that they don't want to do and they don't do. And you have these principles of liberty on both sides in contrast with themselves. And so we need to recognize that slavery is part of that conversation, but we can't just shut ourselves out to the other aspects of what was going on. So then we have the Alamo, and then we have the revolution, and then we have this establishment of the Republic of Texas. And so what does that do? Well, the Republic of Texas basically establishes Texas as a slave state. Whereas before the Republic of Texas, you had these questions. The Republic of Texas intentionally says, you don't have those questions anymore. So if you want to bring your slaves in, they will be provided for. We have assurances from the government that we're not going to touch slavery. And we're also going to put some pretty hard restrictions on free blacks as well. And so in a sense, the Republic of Texas is establishing a state very similar to what the United States has. And so then you're going to start to see more people from the US move into Texas as it's more suitable to them. But that doesn't mean that what's happening on the ground is exactly what the law is saying. Free black like Sam McCullough, his life was much different. He had certain privileges that free blacks weren't supposed to have, and there are others. But we even know with Joe, at the Alamo, there are different kinds of relationships with slavery and relationships that are deep, that run deep. And so, whereas the Republic of Texas established a real slave nation, as a frontier, it didn't always work exactly the way that the law said it should work. But what happens with the Republic of Texas, because of the freedoms offered to slave masters, the number of slaves increases tremendously. And so you go from about 5,000 in 1835 to about 30,000 in 1845, about 60,000 in 1850, and then well over 100,000 by 1860. And so because of the Republic of Texas and then later on the immersion into the United States, Texas will emerge really as a slave place, a place that slavery is firmly established and protections will always reside with the slave nation. So as I think about bringing this conversation to a close, can we move to the, I'm going to end with a couple of stories. Because in a sense, slavery is stories. We can share. Okay. Oh. We'll get there in a second. Oops. Oh, it doesn't come through. Okay, maybe make it a little smaller so we can get the words there. In 1836, interviewers from the WPA approached an old lady named Sarah Ashley. And one of the amazing things about Sarah Ashley is that we have a picture of her. And most of the people, the slaves that were interviewed for the slave narratives, there were no pictures taken of them, but this was one. And she gives an interesting testimony of her life as she was part of this great migration. And one thing about America is we always talk about migrations. We almost identify ourselves as the way that we migrate. And she's part of that migration, but it's kind of a different migration. She says that she was born in Mississippi, although in the 1930 census, when I looked it up, she lists that she was born in Georgia. 1940 census, she says she was born in Alabama. She doesn't know where her parents were born. And yet, according to her testimony here in 1936, she said that her family was purchased by a speculator named Henry Thomas, who was a person that bought a lot of slaves, according to her, and then sold them. He was centered around New Orleans. And so he would take slaves where he purchased them from all areas, and then he would transport them throughout the South and the Southwest to sell them. And so some of her ancestors, some of her family members were taken to Georgia. Remember, she said that she was born in Georgia. Her siblings were taken to Georgia and sold there, and she was there as well. And then she didn't sell in Georgia, and so then he took her back to New Orleans. And then eventually she was purchased in Texas. And then she ended up in San Jacinto, and thus began her life in Texas. According to her, her master would go east all the time to purchase slaves. So he had a lot of land, and apparently he had good money too. She said that she lived on a cotton plantation. So she was part of this economy of cotton growing. But where she was living in the master's house looked a little bit different, which is kind of a difference to slavery compared to Texas versus Mississippi or Alabama, those great plantations that you see in Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina and Georgia and many in Virginia. She said that the master's house was an old log house. Doesn't resemble what we think of as a large slave plantation, but it was Texas. She said we had to pick cotton every day. And as she said, they had an allotment. If they didn't get the allotment, they would be whipped. But actually, she was strong. And she said she was never whipped, at least according to her testimony to the slave narratives. After picking cotton all day, she then had to take that cotton to the cotton gin, which was about, according to her, a mile away. So you work all day and then you have to work about a mile. And I'm sure it's hard enough to walk a mile now. But if you had worked all day doing cotton, and cotton is a very hard crop. My grandfather worked in cotton. They owned a plantation. After the Civil War, they ended up purchasing much of the plantation. And he would tell stories that he would reach into that cotton plant and that it was prickly. And so as you reached into that, it would callous your hands, it would cut your hands. And so one of the things is that people who grew cotton or who picked cotton would have these calloused hands. Kind of like, when you play the guitar with your fingers, it calluses your fingers. Well, this is like to the 10th power. And this is what this woman did every day. And then she would have to go with perhaps blood on her hands, walking a mile. She said, we never had enough to eat, but we survived. And she concluded her testimony saying this, quote, I was all alone, and I thinks of them old times and what was so hard. And I'm ready now for the Lord to call me home. Thinking as I bring this conversation to a close, really when we think about heroes, we talk about the Texas Revolution, there are many heroes. And I'm not saying that we dismiss those heroes of the Texas Revolution, but I think we can also add people like Sarah Ashley to that conversation, because her life was in a similar way, a similar story with a different outcome, but she's too a part of what made America great and what it was. And I hope that this conversation that we've had and we're going to have will help shed light towards that third way, a way in which we can talk about the people of the Texas Revolution. We can celebrate many of the things that happened there, but that we can also celebrate a Sarah Ashley or my great-great-grandfather, Billy Harris. And we have a place for all of them to be celebrated, and that somehow we can find a way to coexist. And in having this conversation, it doesn't mean that we're dismissing some things. It means that we're adding so much more, the depth, the other piece of the coin that shows us our Americanness and our humanity. Indeed, what this is asking us to do is to show our Americanness, our human nature. In a society that's always been divided, part of the reason that we are divided is that we don't share the full story. We only share pieces of it, and it expects us to be a whole by sharing a piece. I'll end it there and I'll open it up to questions.
All right, Dr. Lattimore. This one is got multiple parts.
Lord have mercy.
This person says, can you discuss the Afro-Latino presence at the Alamo during the mission period, their origins, their form of slavery/servitude, and how they intermarried with the local population of indigenous and mestizos?
Mestizos,
excuse me.
I'll be honest, that is not a specialty of mine, and it's not my area. And so I would do a little bit of harm in answering that question. I can answer it, but I would ask the person who asked that question to seek out a better source on that, because it's a little bit beyond my period.
All right.
It's a very good question, and one that really deserves a better person to answer that than me. I'm more of a 19th century person, and so that's a little bit beyond me.
Well, I think this one's interesting, and you'll have an easy time elucidating. It says, I'm puzzled by the UK and France being anti-slavery in America when they were the primary colonizers in Africa, ?
Mm-hmm.
Can you please elaborate on this?
It's a time period thing. Britain and France have an interesting relationship with slavery. And so when you think of the era of colonization, they were pushing it pretty hard. And so they're developing it into a new world, and they're competing with each other, and Spain as well. And so they see colonization as the way to build their empire and to produce money and to send it back to the mother country, and slavery is part of that equation. So they make billions. They build their nation off of exploration and slavery. But by the late 1700s, you have an anti-slavery movement. So the Enlightenment, as we talked about in this discussion, opens up a new generation of thinkers about the institution of slavery. And so really, there are people that always question the institution of slavery, but not as wholeheartedly as you have in the latter period of the 18th century. And so when that happens, then more people start to question it. So they question on theological grounds, they question on ethical grounds, and they also question it on economic grounds. So you have people who may say that slavery is not the greatest economic system because you can't have slavery and get the most work out of a person because they're a slave. Now, what that means is that how can you get maximum output of labor from a slave? Because the slave doesn't have anything, they don't have an incentive to work. And so from an economic perspective, in Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith questions slavery's legitimacy as an economic system. He also questions it morally, but economically, that's where the thing is. You have to beat a slave from his perspective to get them to work. But then, according to Smith, the slave will only do the least that's required to be done. Because why do maximum if I have no incentive to it? Now, we know that there are other ways in which masters can force a slave to work harder, and that can be the threat of losing a family member. But from an intellectual, economic perspective, that's where he's coming from. And so it really leads to questions of slavery as an institution. And then you have, people who feel that the slave trade is so evil. And so, you think about Amazing Grace and the man who wrote Amazing Grace, and, he has this conversion. And the Great Awakening, era of evangelical Christianity really transforms the landscape because now slavery is being questioned from a religious place. And so you have this questioning too. And so in Britain and France, you have very strong anti-slavery movements really emerging by the late 18th century into the 19th century. And so they're in a different place at that time in their development than they are earlier on. So it's really a time period thing. Now, they still want to work with the Republic of Texas and get that cotton. And so just like the northern states didn't have a problem processing and using raw goods from the South. And so many states or nations who claim to be clean of slavery relied on the work of slave labor. And so we shouldn't exonerate Britain and France for saying that they were anti-slavery because they never quite removed themselves from it. They just tried to say that they would. Now, they wouldn't recognize the Confederacy because of it, but they still worked around that issue. So politically, they were saying that they were, but they still did business because, again, slavery is a business, and you have to also look at it as a business system as well. Was that, I guess, did I get that? Was that another part of that question? Okay.
Thank you. Someone wants to know, can you speak to the influence of Texans in New Mexico politics? Basically, slavery post 1836 to 1860, they say.
New Mexico, and this is a little bit beyond me as well, doesn't really develop that kind of slave population. And from my understanding, this is my understanding, and it's limited, it's not going to develop in the same way that it does here for those kinds of reasons. That's also going to be part of the compromise of 1850, and you're going to see that part of the equation. But Texas has a land, the weight of the land is, and the proximity to make it a little bit different than New Mexico, that territory there. You can still have it there, but you can theoretically have slavery everywhere, but it just doesn't work as well in certain places as it does other places.
Someone says, I'm curious to know if you have discovered anything about African landing. It is where James Walker Fannin Jr. transported slaves along the San Bernard River.
No, but I do know that in Texas, there is a significant illegal slave trade that happens here. And so many of the people who are working around Galveston and other places are not just working in, should we say, legal domestic slavery. They're also transporting Africans directly from Africa or other places. And so, yes, there's going to be the transporting of slaves. As you can see from Sarah Ashley's Slave Owner, masters were looking for any slaves that they could get their hands on. And if that resource was not available, they looked to other resources. And in the 1850s, there was a particular desire of certain states, particularly South Carolina and Georgia, to reopen the international slave trade. They didn't get it to work, but they illegally pirated them in. And so that could be part of what she's talking about too. Which then creates whole other issues of slave retentions in Texas and African retentions, and that it may, I think historians and others may want to take a look at Texas as a place that there may be significant retentions because of the number of slaves that were brought in directly after a certain period of time compared to what was happening in the Upper South. And so as we look at the Gullah and Geechee regions of the Georgia Sea Islands, in which you have Blacks who were separated from certain areas and importations, you may have a similar thing down here at a later period, which may be very interesting to see how culture might be different here than it might be in the Upper South.
You mentioned cotton production as a major reason for slave labor in Texas. Can you talk a little about sugarcane? How significant was sugarcane in bringing in enslaved workers into Texas?
In the sugarcane growing regions, and I'm not, that's more of a Louisiana Gulf regional thing. I think cotton is still going to be the major thing here, but in a sense, they can kind of work the same way. I mean, sugarcane is a hard labor crop. You're going to have to kind of produce it and grow it the same kind of way. And so the mentality would probably be the same.
Someone says in the period between Mexican abolition in 1829 and the Mexican-American War, did Mexico make any real attempts to curb slavery in Texas?
It depends on what you classify as real attempts. You have to realize that if it's the state or if it's the centralized government, we're still kind of an outpost. And so I'm not trying to be flippant or funny, but news travels much faster now. I mean, it's going to be on Facebook. I mean, this will be on YouTube probably later tonight, but things here travel a lot slower. And so you have those attempts, but you also have, Mexico tried to get them to convert to Catholicism as well, and that didn't work too well. They tried to say, they're servants, so that, and they did outlaw it. But you had a consistent train of resistance from the people that were here in doing that. And so they weren't following the law of the state or the nation in which they were occupying, in a sense. And so that raises, we all live in nations of laws. And so they were fighting that, petitioning that, sometimes winning those petitions. There certainly was a conversation and negotiations, certainly between the people in Austin and others. And Seguin and others, they were certainly negotiating with the state and the nation. But you kind of have two different perspectives on getting that done. And just think about it. If the Mexican government, which is turning over leadership consistently in this period, I don't know how many times, but it changes leadership so much during this period, and you're developing a nation, what do you do if you emancipate the slaves? Do you compensate the masters? Does Mexico have the money to do that? And so those are other kinds of questions that come with emancipation and manumission, is how do you handle it? And so I think those are questions perhaps that the state and the government had as well. But I also think, how do you, when Santa Anna came, I mean, he sent his troops and came with them, and how long did they go? So how do you have that kind of oversight in this outpost, in a sense? That's why Texas was always a problem place, because it was out there. It wasn't close to the power structure. So that's why it was dangerous. That's why it was a frontier. And that's one of the reasons why it developed the way that it did. So they tried. But it's kind of hard to try it when you have people that say,
Yeah.
And it's kind of hard to try it when you can't just get up on a horse and just go up the street 410 and say, stop that. It's different time period.
Yeah,
News travels a lot slower than it does now.
absolutely. Know all about that.
Yeah.
This is specific to San Antonio. Was slavery a significant part of San Antonio, or was slavery more prevalent in other parts of Texas?
It was more prevalent in East Texas, and that's why you see a larger number of African Americans there even now,
Sure.
certainly around Galveston, because that was the major port, specifically coming from New Orleans to Galveston. But slavery is here, particularly in the southern San Antonio area, the South San Antonio, in the area of Wilson County, San Antonio, areas that you still have these large plantation regions, and cotton can still grow out there. Now the town is a little bit different. Slavery doesn't generally do that well in towns. You can have it, but you don't have large numbers of slaves in towns. And so San Antonio is going to develop kind of as a southern western city. So it has aspects of the South that links it with the historic South and Southwest trajectory that we're talking about. But San Antonio also has a trajectory that's Western as well, that might lean more towards the New Mexico area and other areas. And so slavery is here, but it's not going to be to the degree that it is in other regions. But it's here, and the impact is there. But it's also one of the reasons why you have a smaller Black population, I think, here in the descendants of that. San Antonio's Black population really increases in the years after the Civil War, as Blacks are coming from the town, from outside in those areas out in Seguin and other areas that have more slaves, they're coming to the town. And then after the 1920s, more even come in. So yes, it does, but not like East Texas.
Gotcha. I think we have time for one more. Can you shed some light on freed slaves who went on to own slaves themselves?
Well, let's have a broader conversation on that one. There are slaves that or free Blacks that will own slaves. Now, there are reasons why free Blacks could own slaves. Now, if we think of let's just say you have a state that has a law that says, and many states did, and I think that Texas had something similar, that if you were freed, you had to leave. Well, what happens if you don't? Then you can be theoretically sold back into slavery. So now let's just say you're following the law, but you're married to a white woman. Will you leave? What about your children? So I'm going to have a broader discussion. So let's take in the state that I know more about free Blacks, Virginia. In the early 1800s, the state passed a law that said if you were freed, if you bought your manumission and somehow you became free, you had a year to leave the state. Well, let's just say that law is passed in 1817. So in 1860, you purchased your freedom, but you got a family. So what would families do? The man would purchase himself first, but then you're working to buy all of your family members. So then that's 1816, you purchase your family. You purchase yourself, and then you're working. You have to work for another 3 to 4 years to purchase your children and wife, who by that way might have another couple of kids by that time, so you have to pay more. What do? You are legally free, and you have the right to stay because you can't be you're grandfathered in, but your children and your wife can't stay. Well, what you might do, just what a lot of them did, is you will purchase their freedom, or you will purchase them, but you will not free them. So now you are the owner of your children. And so a lot of free Blacks that you will see that own slaves in the 1820s and the 1830s are as a result of purchasing family members that they were unable to free. Now that can really blow up in your face, because if you own them and you have debts, your children can then be sold for your debts. So I saw one example of where a guy was keeping his family, his wife and 2 kids as slaves, but they were living free lives because he couldn't free them, because they would have to leave the state. but he had debts. And so when he died, the collector came and sold his family, took the land and the family. He tried to free them before he died, but the collector said, you can't do that because you had a debt at the time of the manumission. So that's one course. Now we have other Blacks who will own slaves for profit. And they are a much smaller group, but there are some. Reuben West. There was this book called Black Masters written by James Rourke and Michael Johnson in the 1980s that talked about the Ellison family, who owned like 50 or 60 slaves. You have a number of them in Louisiana. Many of these are children of white men and who were set up and established as plantation owners by their parents. And so they will own slaves. It's a very small percentage, but they do. And so when you talk about Black slave owners, a very small percentage will own slaves for profit and will sell them and transact them in ways just like others do. A larger number, in my mind, will own them because of protecting them. And sometimes it's very difficult to see the difference. And when you see large numbers, and that's more of a lower southern and southwestern phenomena. So the larger slave owners will most likely live in South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana. The poorer free Blacks will live in the upper South and have very few slaves if they own slaves, and then more likely to be their family members. And those that are living as free Blacks in the lower South with slaves are more likely to be classified as mulatto or mixed race. So that is part of the equation as well.
Thank you.
All right.
I feel like I've learned so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, well, we just want to thank all of you who joined us virtually tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Dr. Lattimore is a fountain of knowledge, and it's great to listen to all this information and knowledge that he has. But you know, I do want to bring this back around to the fact that it is Black History Month. And I'm 28 years old. If my mother is still alive, she would be 60. She grew up in a small rural town in Louisiana. And she would tell me about segregation and racism. So we talk about Black history and we talk about these events like they were so long ago, but they really weren't. So for the rest of this month, for the rest of this year, just always I want us to think about how these events that happened not so long ago affect how we interact with each other today. You know, Dr. Lattimore, you're great. So if you know a Dr. Lattimore, that's awesome. Talk to them, gain knowledge, gain information, but you know, your neighbor who looks different than you, talk to them, a classmate, whoever, you know, gain knowledge and information whatever way you can. And that's going to shape and contextualize how we look at things in the future. History, that's what does that. So again, thank you. And I just want you to take that with you for the rest of Black History Month and forever moving forward. So again, thank you for joining us.